So this last panel, we have dubbed the Nonviolent Assessment Panel. And you may think, what? What's up with that? So the name of this panel acknowledges how too often the ways we evaluate students commits what Pierre Bourdieu called symbolic violence by replicating dominant norms, often manifested in the power differentials between instructors and students, and reinforced through coercive practices. So in other words, too often assessment is something that is done to students as opposed to being done with them. So the panelists now in our fourth and final panel are going to share how they disrupted alienating and sometimes humiliating ways of judging student learning by proposing alternatives that better engage students in the process of learning. So this was a popular topic in our anti-racist pedagogy group. So we do have 5 speakers. So Michelle, Briston, Karen, Tyler, and Meredith will speak in that order, as has been our norm. Just go ahead and introduce yourself, talk about what you teach, and then dive into what you have to share with us. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the panel, and then at 2:40 we have intentionally left a 20-minute period for all of us to come together as a big group if there's further discussion about any of the panels and the topics or just further ideas. So take it away, Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Greenwood. I'm the Managing Director for General Education, but I also teach at Merced College, and I've been helping with Spark instructors all semester, so I've been kind of all over the board. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that came out of a technique for differently abled students and that pedagogy, and thinking about the fact that there's about 6% of undergrads that need disability accommodations. And so, as we know from anti-racist pedagogy, that a rising tide raises all boats. And so if it can help our differently abled students, then it can probably help all of our students. And this technique sort of gets at a way to do that without calling anyone out either. So that's kind of a nice thing. I'm going to share my screen real quick with you. Hang on one second, sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is a technique that they recommend for differently abled students, and just being able to give them, so thinking about a formative assessment that you might have coming up, and then using 3 different options for ways to submit for that particular outcome. And so in this particular case, I gave them, we were working on, I've been teaching computer classes over there, so it's working with Microsoft Word, using templates, and they're updating resumes. So that's kind of the formative assessment that we're working on. And so we gave them 3 different ways to do that. They could just choose a template and update it and submit that. They can draw it and then actually create a template, which is kind of another way of thinking about templates. And then also they could just make a video explaining how they would update it. So then I also created 3 different examples for them to see, so they could see this is just, if you took the template straight up and submitted it that way, obviously this is not my real resume, but you could see that. And then I also just gave them an example of like, oh, here's a template I drew real quick one night, and here's what it would look like in Word if I created one. And then I created a video and showed them how to do that. So that's the idea. And again, just thinking about different ways to get at the same assessment, but giving them multiple ways to be able to submit those things. So I will end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Briston.
So I'm trying to figure out it looks like the settings are slightly different for my screen share, so it might just take me a second here to figure it out what's going differently than when I practiced. Maybe one of the options is a little different. My name is Briston. I'm a Unit 18 lecturer in English and Spanish. And I will be talking to you guys today about a podcast assignment that I had in my most recent class, Writing to Save the Planet. Okay, this may be a little clunky. I don't know why it's still showing that whiteboard.
I had the same issue with mine.
Thank you. Thank you, Eileen, for making me feel less sort of like a novice here. Okay, so let's get started. So it's now saying that you guys can't see that, which is unfortunate. I'm just going to wing it. So here I was about to teach a brand new English course, Writing to Save the Planet in a virtual classroom setting. Both in my course design and through ROAR, I'd been thinking about making community a key pillar of my course, both creating community among the students as well as translating complex environmental issues for the community at large. So to work towards building a sense of community, I wanted the students to make collaborative podcast episodes in small groups, but I'd never assigned a podcast before. How would I evaluate this new assignment? During our ROAR meetings, we discussed how traditional methods of evaluation reinforced harmful power differentials between students and the instructor. My interest was piqued when we discussed rubrics co-created with students. I realized I didn't need to know what made an effective podcast episode. Instead, I could ask my students. And I see my partner is trying to help me with the technology here. I explained the general project concept to the class. Students did a 5-minute free write on what they thought made a good podcast episode. For homework, students then distilled their free write into 1 or 2 specific requirements they each thought should be included in our rubric. They then pasted these requirements into a shared class document, which you can see here. This was actually originally an Office doc. They then pasted these. So this shared document basically is all of their feedback. I have a couple requirements or suggestions at the top, but everything else came directly from them. I had no idea how it would go, but when I read over their comments, I realized they all fell into 4 categories. This was episode content, audience engagement, technical details, and overall format. And so I drafted up this rubric. I shared it with the class and we all agreed upon it. So you can see it's exactly the same bullet points, just organized in 4 different groups. During this process, students were both curious and engaged. They seemed particularly excited about the assignment as they had helped to co-create it. And the results, well, let's just say they speak for themselves. So I want you guys to hear from the student voices themselves.
Among the feminists, LGBTQ, Native, and various
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Okay.
identity politics with a community quite literally buried under racism, land use regulations, legal assaults, and, well, a whole lot of trash. Hello, guys. Welcome to UC Merced's Environmental Justice Podcast. Today's episode is People or Profit.
And we're not looking for allies, we're looking for accomplices. I think there's an interesting distinction between those things. Like when we're on the front lines and we're fighting for water and Standing Rock, that we need our allies to be there.
Speaking of change, there are some things that we should stop doing. We need to stop buying stuff. Mass production due to overconsumption of products is the biggest tragedy we face as a demanding society. These massive factories release enormous amounts of CO2, polluting our world.
And if you enjoyed us babbling about civil rights, BLM, Robert D. Bullard, don't forget to join in for UC Merced's Environmental Justice Podcast next episode.
So at the end, I let the students speak for themselves, but you can see here were the results that we found. Thank you.
It's great. Beautiful illustration. I love the circularity too. We started the day by hearing from students, and so we got to hear a little snippet again. Karen, let's hear from you. I think you're muted.
Yes. Hi there. How y'all doing? My name's Karen Lynham. I'm the coordinator for peer assisted learning support of the PALS program. And I want to talk to you today about some of the things that we're doing in PALS to make sure that our learning assistants are ready and able to meet students where they are. Some of the different trainings I have listed here, you can take a look at those. I also have the questions that I'll address during my talk. And then I'll start off with traditional assessment is punitive by nature. Transforming assessment allows numerous ways of learning with multiple pathways to success. And just one moment. So the first question, what does failure have to do with learning? Learning happens through trial and error, in a sense, failure. And when tasked with difficult material, practice is key. Practice includes making mistakes, process of elimination, the how and the why. And all of this is predicated on small failures. These are the many necessary practices that take place before the performance. Students must be willing to try to do a problem that they do not understand. They must practice out loud and learn from their mistakes. Without mistakes, there is no point of reference. PALS, learning assistants, share stories of difficulties and how they overcome the issues. They provide guidance and a lifeline to students who are struggling in a course or with a concept. They show their work and prompt students to share theirs. They may set up a problem with errors so students can sleuth it out. By building a community of learners, students feel safe to ask questions in front of others, to practice, to collaborate. They experience errors, working the process, finding answers together, and it builds their confidence. It is the confidence that comes from failing often that is buoyed by practice. And I think that I'll end with just this short partial quote from a presentation I saw or sat in on recently. The person who said it's Tazen Daniels, said that we need to normalize failure as a part of the journey. And I would say that if we did, there would be no limit to what could be accomplished, and people might be less damaged and more confident in their learning. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And obviously we're having a little glitch with screen sharing. I don't quite know why that is, but you know,
maybe
yeah.
it will resolve itself once I take my screen off. Are you still
Yeah,
screen?
you know, obviously Kristen had a little trouble. I had trouble earlier. I think it's a little bit unpredictable, but I think it's appropriate because you were discussing the power and value of failure to have a little bit of a tech failure.
There you go. That was intended. Yes.
All right. So Tyler, hopefully your stuff will share as well. But I think Maria has slides if
let me just check to see if mine is still selected. Nope. Okay.
Awesome. I'm Tyler Margarettis. I'm a first-year professor of cognitive science, just arrived, and just taught this semester for my first time at UC Merced. And I can't think of a better time to start teaching than in the midst of a pandemic, but with this amazing supportive community of anti-racist pedagogues in development. I want to think this semester about deadlines and exams, two things that, in my experience, were often associated with discipline, punishment, and ranking. These were ways of controlling when students were working. These are tools for punishing students for not working in the right ways or at the right time. And then we use these to sort of tell students whether they're good or bad. And I want to move away from this model entirely. So I'm going to tell you what I tried to do, how it worked out, and then what I think it means. So I basically threw out deadlines. So deadlines were just suggestions. I was teaching a hands-on research methods course. So there were weekly labs that had a deadline a week later, but that deadline was really just a suggestion. If students missed it, they could hand it in later with no points removed. We just asked that they come talk to us, that they come by our office hours, and it became an opportunity to connect and find out what was happening in these students' lives. And we heard, heartbreaking stories of hardship, and then that gave us an opportunity to support them, either by connecting them to the right resources or, just being there for them as people. We did the same thing for exams, which was tricky. So students could do the exam once, and then repeat it as many times as they wanted for an entire week. We even opened it up again towards the end of the semester so that they could return to previous midterm exams. We did this for the final two. And this was really trying to reinforce that learning as a process, that they weren't being punished at the get-go for not knowing the information that we were testing them the first time they were exposed to it. So how did we do this? That seems like a ton of grading. So these were really tough exams. We were testing them on basically everything, but it was graded automatically and online, which meant that they were getting immediate feedback and could then incorporate that feedback into their thinking and then try again the next day and gradually improve their score. So what happened? So the first attempt of the first exam, basically everyone failed. And I was a little terrified that I was gonna lose the class, but that's not what happened. They just buckled down and learned. So by the end of that week, the score on that first midterm was 90%, the average score. And here's an example of how they got there. So each line is a different student, and you see that the students are repeating over and over again until they get to the point where they want to be. This one student was at 98%, really wanted to get to 100, kept going. Students like this, so they said on average that helped control their test anxiety, and also that they learned more using this approach compared to other approaches. And thanks a lot to Adriana Signorini and this Satal team for doing this anonymous exit quiz. Okay, so we start off with this vision of deadlines as exams as disciplining, punishing, and ranking. And I ended up at a place where these were tools for communication, a place to recognize mutual humanity, an opportunity for students to exert their own agency and work towards mastery. Thank you.
Wow, I love the the fireball. Blowing that up. That was great. All right. So kind of continuing a little bit of a theme here. Meredith, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. I am Meredith Vanetta. I'm also a new assistant professor, and I'm in the sociology department. And the law and society class that I taught this term is the first class that I've taught here at UC Merced. And so for me, the discipline of sociology itself and the course theme, law and society, made it pretty easy to integrate anti-racist course material in the actual course content. But until I joined the Roar Collective, I hadn't really thought about the pedagogy through which that content would be communicated, engaged with, and evaluated. So before Roar, I probably would have structured the course in a typical way with lectures, quizzes and exams, and various writing assignments, because that's what we always do. But after discussing the benefits of team-based learning during Roar, I abandoned my usual PowerPoint presentations, I dispensed with the traditional assignments, and I decided to try something new for me, which was, as Briston talked about, a podcast assignment, a team-based podcast assignment. So I'd heard about podcast assignments on Twitter and decided the pandemic was a good opportunity to experiment with something different. I completely rehauled my syllabus outline to incorporate podcasts and other media to complement the relevant readings that I had already planned to assign, and also get students familiar with the genre itself. This also let me center underrepresented voices in ways that other kinds of scholarly sources might not have done. And I also like this assignment because it centered students' voices and gave them a platform to communicate their knowledge to the public in a really accessible way, which I also think that scholarly sources don't often do. So students had several individual and team-based assignments that scaffolded up to the final project, which was supposed to be a 10 to 12 minute podcast on a topic within law and society. Some of them ended up being 15 minutes, but I said that was okay. Students worked collaboratively in teams of 5, and I had like 60 students, to do the background research, script development, and final production. Sometimes I gave them time in class with Zoom breakout rooms, and I used Zoom polling to just check in about podcast progress, to check in about how they were feeling about it, if they needed more time, more support. And my teaching assistant and I also provided detailed feedback on their research and podcast prototypes throughout the semester. So there wasn't like a big surprise at the end. We had time to really figure out what was going well, what was going not so well, and how we could intervene. And despite the many challenges that the students faced this semester, I was just really impressed by the way that they were able to collaborate, how excited they got about some of the things that they were working on. And after listening to each podcast, the students were able to fill out peer feedback forms for their classmates. They also voted for a People's Choice Award. So I had an element of like a contest that wasn't really competitive, but just, kind of fun. And the winning podcast is, which is actually a really creative and incisive look at the history history and continued relevance of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's actually featured now on the Sociology website. So I got everyone's permission on the team, and you can just check it out now if you want. I'll drop the link in the chat. But I got good feedback on this. I think it was, a kind of a good experiment, and I look forward to sort of adjusting it as we move back into, I guess, normal times. So thank you.
Right. Fantastic. All right. So I think everyone is, inspired. There's lots of activity in the chat. And now we have an opportunity. We actually have, we gained back a little time. When does that ever happen? It's because we're like disrupting the notion of how we do conferences, right? So we're just all doing a little thing. So this is for those of you, actually, I'm sorry, we gained back a little time, and we have a full 10 minutes then for discussion specifically with these panelists before we just open more generally to include everything. Sue Varnett, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing everything. So Tyler, I have a question, I guess, that is more for you, but of course anybody is welcome to jump in. But I was thinking about how, like, shifting the way the exams are done, and you made a comment that, like, everything was graded immediately and online, as opposed to, like, I have to manually grade everything that I do, whether it's online or not. And so, so I'm just thinking, and I'm also thinking about, like, the people power and the people resource it takes to be creative and come up with these things and redo and reimagine. And so I'm curious, like if this may not be a fair question to ask, but, like, let's just pretend that you had to grade everything manually, either online or in person. Like, how is there a way that you could make what you did feasible with a full teaching load, for example?
Honestly, I don't think so. And so I did this with 2 TAs. And so they were instrumental in helping us transform what normally would be short answer, open-ended questions into multiple choice, fill in the blank questions that it wasn't dumbing it down. It was still really getting at the content, but that took a lot of work on the front end. Now we have that question bank. And so going forward, every year I teach this every year in the spring, probably, I'm going to have that. But there was definitely a shift in the labor to the front, and I don't think it would be possible I'll tell you, these exams, the midterm exam had 300 questions on it. It was huge. And there's no way that we could have done that manually and done it.
So if I could jump in here, Susan, I'm a humanist. I have a lot of papers to grade and so forth. The last class I taught was a course on creativity, and I had the students create their own exam. That was the work, right? And then they collectively put in their possible exam questions, and they talked about them, they voted on them, then they revised them collectively. And before we even had them, I say we because I was team teaching this with one of my graduate students, before we had them prepare the exam, we had 2 other assignments. The first was to talk about a bad exam that you had taken and talk about a good exam you had taken. And then on the basis of those, to try to extrapolate what made for an exam that would actually facilitate learning. And then they wrote their exam. And they did it collectively. And it was the best teaching and learning experience that I've ever seen in any class I've ever done. And they did the work. And they did the learning. It was really powerful.
In addition to what Dr. Camfield just said, I was thinking about many hands make light work, right? So I was thinking in terms of folks that have to do a lot more manual type grading, that perhaps, you could get a group of folks like-minded who want to help you build this front end before it all starts. And then you can all utilize the same bank for a variety of different quizzes or tests where you're examining, different things about writing that that would have, the same answers or quite similar answers. And then maybe those could be the quick check-ins, the quizzes that they could go to maybe prior to a writing assignment. Just different ways of looking at, what are the elements of creative writing? What are, how do you manage, sorry, I don't know if I can get this phone to go off, but how do you manage, how do you build complexity into your writing? What are the things that are necessary for that to happen? And so maybe some quizzes that, look at the different parts of the writing process might be an option too. And in addition, I think that the group writing assignment too, as far as, you could put a group together and have them go over the different parts of writing to make sure that, you're going to get a variety of levels. They're all going to have to discuss it. They're going to hopefully by the end know what is necessary in each part of the writing to make it work and make it successful in the end. And then maybe it doesn't take away all of the manual assignments that you'll have to grade, but it might ease the burden of the load of labor that you have to have on a regular basis. Food for thought.
Yeah, I think to just maybe reinforce a little bit of what you were saying, Karen, is to think about, too often assessment is about evaluating a product, right? A single performance. And, to Tyler, what you were talking about ranking and judging. And, how can we make assessment, the process of assessment itself, a learning experience for our students, and so that ultimately the score they earn on a particular performance is much less important than the process that they've engaged in. Some folks are private messaging me, Tyler, about wasn't he worried about students cheating if they were repeating the same exam again? And I think this obsession with students cheating, that's a sign that we're locked in this kind of arms race of assessment as a weapon. And, and I use that language really intentionally because this is nonviolent assessment that we're trying to talk about on this panel. So I wanted to throw that out there, and I'd love to hear, anyone's, thoughts about making the journey more important than the destination. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I think, and so in a different class that I taught this semester, there's another formative assessment that becomes part of the summative assessment. And so, it was one of the learning outcomes is they're supposed to be able to compare and contrast some psychological theories and that sort of thing, right? In a psychology class that I was teaching. And so in one sort of lower stakes assignment, they're having to do a massive amount of work because they're having to give out a whole bunch of theories and what do they all mean and what are the, when were these developed and what are they drawing on and, all these questions that they're having to answer about it. And so they completed that assignment, but then in this, in the end, then I'm like, well, just compare three things, compare three of them. And they could do that pretty rapidly. But by then we had done that multiple times throughout the semester. And really they were pretty low stakes throughout the semester. It was only on the final exam that it felt really sort of, probably more oppressive. But even then, by then they had done it so many times, they were sort of like, yeah, I got this. So I think that might be one way too, is just even scaffolding our exams, or if that's the way we're phrasing it, if that's the word we're going to use for it, is just thinking about some of those elements to implement.
Thank you.